Hello, it's Amy. I'm here once again with some Honoré de Balzac. Here next to my lovely tree. It's all lit up. It's the evening and my apartment is perfectly cozy. It was perfectly cozy for me to lie on the sofa and read a couple of Balzac's short stories from the second volume of my set. And the first one that I read this evening was one called A Forsaken Lady. And I didn't like it too much. I liked where it was going, but it's almost as though Balzac hurried along the plot, and we got this big time jump and this big jump in the story. And I would have preferred it to be either focused on a smaller period of time or for this story to have been a novel, because we start out in a provincial town, a young man the age of 22 or 23. At one point it says he's 23. At another, a lady says to him, "You're barely 22." So he's 22 or 23. This young man by the name of Neil. I think his full name is Gaston de Neul, or Neil, Gaston de Neul. But anyway, this young man comes to this provincial town, and Balzac gives us some really humorous depictions and descriptions of the people in this humorous town. He talks about this local family who's known for having links to nobility and who lives as though they're part of the aristocracy. The only problem is they live, 20 or 30 years behind in terms of the standard of living and the fashions. They still have old style carriages, and they still have their old silver and their old dishes, and they're probably not as well off as they seem, but they maintain this very stately demeanor because of their name. But the only problem is if you go, 20 miles out of the town, no one's ever heard of this family who supposedly has connections to so and so, and they're connected to this aristocratic family. But that was quite a funny way to start, just giving us some characterizations of the people in this provincial town. But Gaston de Neul shows up, and he becomes enchanted with a lady that he hears about, a lady who is called the Forsaken Lady. The story is called A Forsaken Lady, and she is the Forsaken Lady. She lives completely alone. Her name is Madame de Beausant, or Beausant, Madame de Beausant, and she has been living alone in this town, not really seeing anyone for several years. And people feel quite bad for her, but they feel that she's doing the right thing. Because what has happened is she's in her late 20s, but she married for love. And her husband ended up leaving her after only a couple of years into their marriage because he no longer cared for her. He no longer loved her. And so she is forsaken and abandoned. And she certainly feels as though she can't go off and fall in love again, because that would not be the proper or correct thing to do. That would ruin her even more than she's already ruined. People don't pay calls on her, because she is a woman who is separated from her husband. But she has this sense of propriety, where she's not going to see other men, even though her husband has abandoned her for several years. But of course, Gaston tricks his way into her presence and declares his love for her. And she almost immediately falls in love with him as well, although she's a bit coy. And then she picks up and moves to another town far away where no one's going to know them. I think they even leave the country. They leave France. And he follows her as he thinks that she is intending him to do. And they move in together, spend several years together, and then his father dies. He goes back to his home estate where he's going to inherit. He's going to inherit the estate and all this property and money. And his mother, of course, says, "It's time for you to marry." And of course, he can't marry his mistress because she is still technically married. He can't formally introduce his mistress to anyone because that wouldn't be proper in the eyes of society. He can't, his mother won't even meet his mistress. And he's not really inclined to marry. I think at this point he's in his mid to late 20s by the time this happens. And a young lady with a large fortune, she's 22, has taken a fancy to him. His mother, everybody wants him to marry this young lady. He doesn't really want to, but his mistress, Madame de Beauchamp, realizes that, or at least she feels that she's about to be abandoned again. And she doesn't want to hold him. She doesn't want to hold a man who isn't really in love with her anymore over the sake of duty, especially a man who isn't her husband and who should be taking on these roles in life, at least from her perspective. And so she writes a letter letting him go. And he is devastated by this, but he marries, ends up in a loveless marriage, and before too long attempts to go back to his mistress who refuses to see him and writes him a letter that sends him into his final despair. And so it really is just a story of very unhappy people, a story of a young man who falls in love and then because of the expectations of society is unable to stay with his mistress, to stay with the woman he loves. And it's the story of that brief loveless marriage, and I guess this all drives him to his death. I can't say I really enjoyed it because we did have these wonderful opening scenes where Gaston first goes to see Madame de Beauchamp, and we've got these coy lines, these humorous descriptions of the people, and then Balzac jumps us right ahead into the future, almost immediately into this marriage, and then immediately into the death of Gaston. And that's pretty much it. So I can't say I enjoyed it all that much. I did like the premise. I just wish that had been fleshed out a little bit more. But I moved on from A Forsaken Lady to another short story in this volume called La Grenadiere. And we begin with Balzac setting the scene, as he often does, and he describes to us this wonderful little house with this large orchard, these large gardens that grow everything from, licorice root to pears to melons, and it's just this beautiful, almost Eden on earth outside this little house, but it's more of a cottage than what you would think of as a grand house. It's got just 2 bedrooms, a drawing room, a dining room, and a kitchen. And we are introduced to a lady who comes to stay with her 2 young sons. And she is a bit of a mystery. Although she dresses very plainly, her manners indicate that she's from a higher class. And we do eventually find out that she is a lady with a title. She's got 2 sons, Louis and Marie, and I was a little bit confused for about half the story because I saw the name Marie, which is spelled Marie, just as you would expect, and I just assumed that the second child was a girl because I had no idea. I had no idea that Marie had ever been a boy's name. But you have these 2 young sons. Marie is the younger, Louis is a little bit older, and the mother is this mysterious recluse who's just on the outskirts of town at this cottage with their servant, and she is doing her best to ensure that her 2 sons become educated, but she is putting most of her focus on the older one, on Louis, because as we find out midway through the story, she isn't going to live very long, and she has made some sort of mistake in her past that is going to lead to her sons being orphaned and alone in the world. And it's very important to her that the sons have possession of their birth certificates and of the 12,000 francs and of a piece of paper that's not entirely explained, but seems to have something to do with either their birth or with some sort of lineage or inheritance that they might be able to get at some point in the future. But we are given to understand that although she was a great lady in society, and she was well known in Paris, and that she was well married, she is no longer with her husband because of an error that she's made. And it does seem to be an error in romance, an error in love. The father of at least one of her sons, perhaps both of her sons, is not her husband. She asks her boy Louis to write a letter just as she knows she's going to die, informing her husband who the sons have never met and seem to have no idea about, informing her husband about the death of his wife and saying that she has forgiven him. And we get some little mystery in here about the father of the two boys, or at least of one of the boys, having been killed, doing what was right, or protecting her, or protecting the family, or something like that. And so it's sort of, well, it's hard to say, but possibly what's happened here is she had some sort of affair with this man, ended up giving birth to one or both of her sons. And well, I would assume it's probably both, because if one of the sons was the natural child of her husband, certainly in this day and age when Balzac was writing, the husband would have held custody of the child rather than the mother. But I would sort of hypothesize that perhaps her husband killed her lover in some sort of duel when he found out the children weren't his, or found out that they were having a love affair. Whatever happened, she is estranged from her husband, has been living apart, and is worried about her sons being orphans, and wants to let her husband know that she forgives him for whatever he did. And so it's an interesting mystery like that. And I quite enjoyed it, although there's not much to it. That's really all we get. We're left with more questions than answers here. But Louis, who I'm assuming is somewhere between the ages of, 12 and 16 or something, decides and comforts his mother in her death by saying that he's going to leave 10,000 of the francs with the elderly servant and ensure that his brother Marie is sent to the local school. And he's going to take the remaining 2,000 francs and go off to sea and earn his fortune as a sailor. And that's exactly how this story really ends, with him climbing aboard a ship and crying. And we have this really interesting line, "There is no need to cry, lad. There is a God for us all," said an old sailor with rough kindliness in his thick voice. The boy thanked him with pride in his eyes. Then he bowed his head and resigned himself to a sailor's life. He was a father. And there's also a note down here that it was written or published in August of 1832. But this line, "he was a father." Unless I missed something, I don't think it refers to him becoming a biological father. I think it rather refers to the fact that he's taken on this fatherly role at such a young age and become the father to his brother Marie, who is at school, which I think is well, I was going to say a nice sentiment. It's a heartwarming sentiment to think of this boy deciding to step away and sort of become the father figure for his young brother, when he certainly could have continued on as a child, or just taken off on his own. I don't think anyone would have blamed him if he had decided that his brother was a hindrance at this point, especially given the situation they were in, and the fact that the maid, or the housekeeper, the elderly housekeeper, probably could have continued to look after Marie if the situation called for it. But yeah, there we go. Two interesting little stories by Balzac. Similar themes here. Women who have been forsaken in some ways by their husbands and by society as well, and who are struggling with those consequences. One who is wealthy and goes on to try to live a good life, but isn't happy in the end, and the other who doesn't have a whole lot of money, and who's, well, she's unhappy as well because she dies. But that's Balzac for you. I've noticed in Balzac people are very, very rarely happy in the end. And I've got just a couple more short stories in this book to get through. The next one is called The Message. We have one called Gobsick. And I think those might be the two here. The Message and Gobsick. And so I'll probably work through these in the next couple of days.